The storm had passed hours ago, yet the prairie still held its breath. Dust clung to the air like sorrow refusing to settle, and the faint whistle of the wind carried through the half-burnt fence posts that marked what used to be the stage trail to Willow Creek. The evening light stretched long and gold across the land, painting every dry stalk and lonely wagon track with the hue of goodbye. That was when the mail coach came into view, creaking, worn and slow, its wheels cutting shallow wounds into the mud. Inside sat a young woman with trembling hands and a heart full of prayers she'd forgotten how to say. She had been traveling for 4 days from the east, promised to a man she had never met. The agency had called her a mail-order bride, though the word bride felt far too heavy for a woman who owned nothing but a carpet bag and a fading photograph of someone else's home. She had answered the advertisement out of desperation, not love. A farmer in the territory needed a wife. She needed a place to survive the winter. It was supposed to be simple, a trade of loneliness for shelter. Yet as the coach rattled closer to the mountains, she could feel something inside her ache, something deeper than hunger, sharper than fear. When the coach finally stopped at the lonely outpost of Dry Hollow, the driver helped her down. The settlement was smaller than she expected. A saloon with half its sign missing, a church whose bell hadn't rung in years, and a few scattered ranch houses half swallowed by dust. The man she was supposed to marry was nowhere in sight. Instead, a figure stood apart from the others, leaning quietly against the hitching post near the old blacksmith's barn. His presence was calm but unsettling, the way firelight moves without sound. He wore the scars of a life spent on the edges of two worlds, the tanned skin, the black braids bound with leather, the silver jewelry catching the dying light. He was an Apache warrior, though not like the stories whispered in the towns. No one spoke to him. No one dared. The few settlers passing by offered her brief, awkward glances, half pity, half warning. The driver cleared his throat, muttered something about unloading her things, and left as fast as the horses would take him. She was alone. The wind rose, carrying with it the sound of the blacksmith hammering in the distance, each strike echoing like a heartbeat she didn't own. She tried to stand tall, to seem strong, but her knees trembled. She hadn't eaten since morning, and her breath came uneven from the long ride. The Apache didn't move until the coach disappeared over the ridge. Only then did he lift his gaze toward her. It wasn't a hostile stare. It was quiet, observant, as though he could hear every unspoken word she'd tried to bury. She looked away, clutching her shawl tighter. The rumors said the local tribe kept to the hills now, far from the white towns, but sometimes one would come down for trade or to work odd jobs. Still, she hadn't expected one to stand there, watching her arrival like a silent witness. The sun was nearly gone when the door of the small cabin across the street swung open. An older woman with a stern face appeared, wiping her hands on her apron. "You're the bride?" she asked, her tone sharp as pine smoke. The girl nodded. The woman's gaze softened for a moment, then hardened again. "You best come inside before the night takes hold. Your husband-to-be won't be back till morning. There's food if you don't mind it cold." Inside, the air smelled of old coffee and damp wood. The woman set down a tin plate of beans and bread, and the girl ate slowly, aware of the eyes that lingered outside the window. The Apache hadn't moved. He stood under the post lantern, face half-shadowed, still watching. The woman noticed and frowned. "He don't talk much," she muttered. "Lost most of his people in the wars. Works with the horses sometimes. Don't pay him no mind." But the girl did. She couldn't help it. There was something about him that pulled at her, like recognition, though she'd never met him before. When the woman went to bed, she sat by the window, listening to the night settle over the land. Coyotes called from far off, and the dry wind brushed against the shutters with a sigh. The ache she'd been carrying for weeks deepened, not just in her body but in her spirit, a dull, throbbing reminder of everything she'd lost. The silence of the room pressed down until she whispered, just to hear her own voice. "I've been aching down there, like something inside me's dying." She hadn't meant for anyone to hear. But outside, the Apache lifted his head. For a long moment, neither moved. The window pane was thin, and her voice had slipped through it like smoke through a crack. Embarrassment flushed her face, but she didn't pull back. The loneliness was too much. She stared at him through the glass, her eyes meeting his, and for the first time that night, she saw no judgment, only understanding. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His stillness said more than words ever could. He'd known pain deeper than hers, loss that stripped the soul clean. He had carried his tribe's silence through years of betrayal and blood, and in that silence, he recognized hers. The next morning, she woke before dawn to the sound of horses in the yard. Her husband-to-be had arrived, a broad-shouldered rancher with a cruel mouth and whiskey on his breath. He barely looked at her before muttering about work and tossing a saddle aside. The marriage would happen that afternoon, the preacher said. There was no ceremony planned, no guests, only the legal words to bind her to a man she didn't know. The Apache was there again, standing near the corral, his hands resting on the fence. The rancher spoke to him roughly, giving orders about fixing a broken gate, but the warrior's eyes never left hers. She felt the weight of that gaze like a truth she wasn't ready to name. By midday, the sky turned white with heat. She tried to keep busy, washing clothes and sweeping the porch, but the unease in her chest wouldn't fade. Every time the wind changed, she caught the scent of horses and smoke, and of something else faint and wild that reminded her of him. That night, as she sat by the small fire behind the cabin, he appeared again. He didn't approach. He just stood in the shadows, quiet as ever. She didn't know why she spoke, only that silence had become unbearable. "You heard me last night," she said softly. He gave a slow nod. The fire cracked between them, the light flickering across his face. "I shouldn't have said that," she added. It wasn't right. Still, he didn't answer. His eyes drifted toward the mountains where thunderclouds gathered in the distance. When he finally looked back, there was something in his expression, something that made her chest tighten. He wasn't pitying her. He was listening, truly listening. She swallowed hard, her voice trembling. "I don't know how to be what they expect. I came here to start over, but it already feels like I'm vanishing." For the first time he spoke, his voice low and rough like gravel over stone. "You are not gone," he said. "You are still breathing." The words struck her like a spark in the dark. She didn't know what to say, so she just nodded, tears threatening but never falling. The night grew colder and he turned to leave. Before he vanished into the shadows, she found herself whispering, "Will you come again tomorrow?" He paused but didn't answer. The silence that followed was both a promise and a warning. The ache in her chest changed shape. Not gone, but different, alive with something she didn't understand. The next day would bring the wedding, the vows, the life she had agreed to out of desperation. But as the storm clouds rolled over the prairie, she felt that something had already shifted. The mail-order bride who had come to the desert seeking a husband now stood on the edge of something far greater, something dangerous, forbidden, and quietly consuming. And that night, when the first thunder cracked across the sky, the lonely Apache was already waiting in the dark, listening once more. The sky opened with a roar that evening, and the rain came down like it hadn't in months. The dry land drank every drop, and the smell of wet dust rose through the air, sharp and alive. She stood by the small window of the cabin, her hands trembling against the sill as the preacher's buggy pulled away through the mud. The vows had been said, the paper signed, and the ring, a small iron band meant more for marking ownership than love, sat heavy on her finger. The rancher, now her husband, had disappeared into the barn soon after, muttering about tending the horses before the storm worsened. She hadn't seen him since. Inside, the fire was dying. The room felt smaller now, filled with the silence of something unfinished. Her eyes wandered toward the corral, where the dim outline of the Apache stood under the rain. He wasn't sheltering himself. He faced the storm as if it belonged to him, every drop sliding down his bare shoulders like memory. The sight stirred something deep within her, an ache not of the flesh but of spirit. She turned away, biting her lip, ashamed of her own thoughts. The night stretched long. She couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face in the dark. Those eyes that had seen more sorrow than words could hold. She wondered what stories were buried in that silence. What had brought him to this forgotten village where people still looked over their shoulders at his kind? She had heard whispers in town earlier, from women at the well. They said he once led his people through the mountains, that he'd lost everything in a raid led by men wearing the same kind of hat her husband now wore. Some said he stayed near the settlement because he had nowhere else left to go. Others claimed he was waiting for something, or someone. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world quiet and washed clean. The rancher returned from the barn, his boots caked in mud. He spoke little, only telling her to keep the fire lit and prepare food by noon. His voice carried no warmth, only the dull command of a man who'd forgotten what kindness felt like. She obeyed as expected, though her heart wasn't in it. While she worked, her thoughts kept drifting back to the man she'd seen in the rain. At midday, she stepped outside with a bucket, pretending to fetch water from the well. The land still shimmered with puddles and the air smelled of sagebrush and wet timber. That's when she saw him again. The Apache was repairing the fence by the northern pasture, the same one the rancher had cursed about earlier. His movements were steady, careful, almost graceful, as if the world slowed to match his rhythm. She hesitated before walking closer. The sound of her boots in the mud caught his attention, and he looked up. Their eyes met again, and the same quiet understanding passed between them, wordless but heavy. "You're fixing the fence," she said softly, unsure why she needed to speak. He gave a small nod. "It keeps the horses safe." Her fingers tightened on the handle of the bucket. "You work here often?" "Only when he needs me," he replied, meaning her husband. His tone was neither bitter nor kind, just factual. Then he turned back to the task, hammering the post into the ground. She wanted to ask more, but the words wouldn't come. The weight of her new life pressed on her chest. She turned to leave, but before she could, he said, "You do not belong here." She froze. "What do you mean?" He stood up straight, his dark hair falling over his shoulders, rainwater still glistening in the strands. "This land eats people who come to it for the wrong reason," he said quietly. "It will take your breath, your spirit, until you forget who you are." His words struck deep. She didn't answer. The wind picked up, brushing between them like a warning. She walked back toward the cabin, but the sound of his voice lingered in her mind long after. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, she watched her husband at the table. He barely looked at her while he ate. His eyes were tired, his hands rough and scarred from years of labor. She wondered if he had ever been gentle once, long ago, before the loneliness turned him into stone. When he finished his meal, he stood without a word and left again for the barn. Hours passed. The house creaked with the weight of silence. She couldn't take it anymore. She stepped outside, drawn once more by the faint glow near the corral. The Apache sat by the dying embers of a small fire, sharpening his knife in the quiet. He didn't look surprised when she approached. "You were right," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't belong here." He glanced up, the knife paused mid-motion. "Then why stay?" She let out a slow breath. "Because I have nowhere else to go." For a moment, neither spoke. The night air was cool, and the scent of mesquite smoke curled between them. In that silence, she felt more seen than she ever had since leaving home. "I came here because I thought being someone's wife meant being safe," she continued. "But I don't feel safe. Not from this land. Not from him. Not even from myself." He listened, eyes steady, never interrupting. When she finished, he nodded slowly. "The land listens too," he said. "If you speak to it, it remembers you. But if you stay silent, it forgets you, like it forgot my people." His words carried a sadness that made her chest tighten. She knelt near the fire, watching the sparks rise. "I don't want to be forgotten," she whispered. He looked at her then, and for the first time she saw something almost like sorrow in his face. "Then don't stay silent," he said. Before she could reply, the sound of heavy boots approached from the barn. Her husband's voice cut through the dark, rough and suspicious. "What in hell are you doing out here?" he barked. She stood quickly, her heart pounding. I couldn't sleep," she said. The fire can wait," he snapped, glaring at the Apache. You stay away from her. You hear me?" The warrior didn't answer, but the tension between them was thick enough to choke on. Her husband grabbed her arm and dragged her back toward the house. "You don't speak to him again," he muttered through gritted teeth. "You don't know what he's capable of." Inside, he slammed the door behind them. The air felt heavy, suffocating. She sat by the hearth long after he went to bed, staring into the flames. She could still feel the echo of the Apache's voice in her mind. "Don't stay silent." The following days passed in uneasy rhythm. She did her chores, kept her head down, avoided her husband's temper. But she could feel eyes on her, sometimes from the ridge beyond the corral, sometimes from the trees by the creek. She didn't know whether to fear it or welcome it. Then one afternoon, a rider arrived from town, a deputy. He spoke in hushed tones with her husband near the barn, glancing toward the hills. She couldn't hear every word, but she caught enough. There'd been trouble near the reservation. A ranch raided, livestock missing, tracks leading west. Some said it was the Apaches again. That night, her husband took his rifle and left with 2 men from the settlement. She stayed alone, the house colder than ever. Hours passed and the wind began to howl outside. Then, faintly through the noise, she heard a knock, soft, steady, not meant to frighten. She opened the door just enough to see him standing there, rain dripping from his hair, eyes dark and calm. They will come back angry, he said.
They will blame the wrong people, her breath caught.
You mean, they'll blame you? He gave a slow nod. They always do. She stepped aside before she even thought about it. Come in, she whispered. He hesitated only a moment before crossing the threshold. The warmth of the fire lit his face, and for a second, the world outside felt far away. She didn't know what she was risking, only that something in her refused to let him face it alone. The storm outside grew louder, shaking the shutters. Inside, silence fell again, thick and uncertain. He stood by the door, every muscle tense, listening for sounds beyond the wind. She sat near the fire, clutching her shawl. Their eyes met, and in that quiet she understood what he couldn't say. Something was coming, and as thunder cracked above the valley, the lonely mail-order bride and the forgotten Apache stood together in a world that would not forgive either of them. The storm carried on through the night, shaking the little cabin as if the mountains themselves were angry. Every gust of wind rattled the window panes, and flashes of lightning lit the room in brief, sharp bursts of white. She sat by the hearth, her shawl pulled close, while the Apache stood near the door, silent and alert. His presence should have frightened her, but it didn't. There was something about his stillness, steady, grounded, that made her feel less alone. He wasn't hiding from the thunder. He was listening to it, reading it, as though every sound spoke a warning. They're not coming back tonight, she whispered, her voice barely louder than the wind. He didn't turn, only nodded slightly. Not tonight. But soon her heart sank. And when they do? He looked at her then, eyes dark and steady. They will look for blood to blame. It will not matter whose. She stared into the flames, the heat brushing against her face. My husband won't believe you're innocent. He already doesn't, he said simply. Men like him never need truth. Only reason to hate. The words lingered, heavier than thunder. She wanted to argue, to tell him her husband wasn't cruel, just broken. But she couldn't. The truth was something she'd been avoiding since she arrived in Dry Hollow. The man she'd married didn't love her, didn't even see her as a person. She was part of the trade, someone to cook, clean, and keep the loneliness away. But loneliness couldn't be bought off. It stayed and it grew. She rose to pour him some water, her hands trembling as she set the cup on the table. You've lived here a long time? She asked, trying to calm the silence between them. Too long, he murmured. I stayed because my brother was buried on this land. I could not leave him. Her eyes lifted. He died here? Yes, he said. In a raid years ago, the soldiers came through the valley chasing our people. They burned what they couldn't take. When it ended, I came back alone. She felt a weight in her chest. I'm sorry. He nodded once, not for sympathy, but as a quiet acknowledgement of shared pain. The fire crackled between them. He glanced toward the window. When your husband returns, you must stay away from the valley. There is talk of soldiers again. The air feels like it did before war. His words sent a chill through her. She wanted to ask more, but he had already turned toward the door. Before leaving, he looked back once. If you hear the drums, he said, do not go outside. Then he vanished into the storm. When the door shut, she was left with the crackling fire and the sound of her heartbeat. By dawn, the storm had passed. The valley was thick with fog, and silence hung heavy over the land. She stood on the porch, watching the sun struggle through the mist. From the ridge, a single horse appeared, her husband returning with the others. They looked worn, their faces tight with anger. She ran to meet him, heart pounding, but his eyes stopped her cold. Where is he? He demanded, jumping off his horse. Who? She asked, startled. The Apache, he growled. Don't lie to me. You let him in. Her stomach turned. He came because he was warning us. He said, I don't care what he said, he snapped, gripping her arm hard enough to hurt. He's been spotted near the North Ridge. The livestock are gone. The tracks lead toward his people's ground. You think I'm blind? She tried to pull free. You're wrong. He wouldn't. Don't defend him, he hissed, his face inches from hers. You don't know what they're capable of. He let her go and turned toward the men waiting near the corral. We ride again tonight. We'll find him before sunrise. As the horses galloped off, she felt something hollow open inside her. She went back into the cabin and sat at the table, staring at the untouched cup of water he had left behind. The sun moved slow across the floorboards, and every creak of the house made her flinch. By late afternoon, the quiet had become unbearable. She walked down the path toward the creek, hoping to find a moment of peace. The land stretched wide and golden, but the air was strange, thick, expectant, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Then from the trees ahead came a whisper of movement. She froze. A shadow emerged from the brush. It was him. He was limping slightly, his shoulder grazed by something dark, blood faint but real. Her breath caught. "They came sooner than I thought," he said softly, steadying himself against a tree. "They're hunting in the hills now." She rushed forward.
You're hurt!
"It's nothing," he said, though his breath was shallow. "One of them fired. I moved too slow." She tore a piece from her sleeve and pressed it against the wound. "You can't go back out there. They'll kill you." He met her eyes. "They'll come here next. They think I've been hiding with you." Her pulse raced. "Then we'll tell them you left. That I haven't seen you." "They will not believe," he said. "Your husband's pride is already burned. He won't stop until he finds something to destroy." The words broke her heart because she knew they were true. She wanted to protect him, but she didn't even know how to protect herself. She looked toward the ridge, where dark clouds were beginning to gather again. "Then what do we do?" He was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. "There's a place beyond the canyon," he said finally. "Old ground my people once used. No one goes there anymore. It's hidden. If I can reach it by nightfall, they won't find me." She shook her head. "You can't ride in your condition. You'll bleed out before you reach it." He gave a faint smile, almost a sad one. "I've walked farther for less." She wanted to argue, but a faint sound from the hills stopped her. Hoofbeats, faint but growing. Panic surged through her chest. "They're coming," she whispered. He looked toward the sound, then back at her. "Go inside. Lock your doors. Say nothing. I can't just let them go," he said firmly. She hesitated, then did as he said, retreating to the cabin just as the riders appeared at the ridge. From the window, she saw them fan out across the field, her husband at the front. His rifle gleamed in the fading light. He shouted orders to search the area, his voice hard and certain. They combed through the trees, kicking over brush and shouting threats into the wind. Her hands shook as she waited. Every minute felt like an hour. She prayed he'd escaped unseen, prayed the tracks would vanish in the mud. But then she heard a single gunshot echo through the valley. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. The men returned close to dusk, their faces cold and wordless. Her husband's eyes were darker than she'd ever seen. "He's gone," he said shortly, pushing past her into the cabin. "And if he's not dead yet, he will be by morning." She didn't ask what that meant. She couldn't. She just stood there as he poured whiskey into a cup and drank until his hands stopped shaking. That night, when he finally passed out by the fire, she slipped outside, her bare feet cold on the dirt. The moon hung low and the valley was quiet. She followed the creek toward the woods, her heart pounding with every step. The forest smelled of pine and rain. Then she saw him, leaning against a fallen log, alive but barely. Relief washed through her so strong it hurt. She knelt beside him, touching his arm gently. "They think you're dead," she whispered. He opened his eyes slowly. "Then let them think it." She smiled weakly through tears. "You should rest." "I can't stay," he murmured. "They'll come again. And if they find me here, they'll take it out on you." Her throat tightened. "Then let me help you leave, just until you're safe." He didn't answer right away. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the rustle of wind in the trees. Finally, he said, "You would risk everything for someone you barely know." "You listened when no one else did," she said softly. "That's more than anyone's done for me in a long time." His gaze lingered on her, deep and unreadable. Then he nodded. "At dawn," he said, "when the light touches the ridge." She nodded, and they sat together in the quiet, waiting for the night to end. But beyond the hills, a thin line of firelight flickered. Campfires of men who hadn't given up the hunt. And in that moment, she knew dawn would bring more than escape. It would bring the reckoning both of them had been running from since the day she arrived in Dry Hollow. The first light of dawn spread thin over the valley, pale and uncertain, as if the sun itself hesitated to rise on what was coming. The air was sharp with the smell of rain and pine, and the land, usually still, seemed to tremble under the weight of something unseen. She stood at the creek's edge, clutching her shawl tight, watching as the Apache packed what little he had into a small hide satchel. His movements were slow, his wound still fresh, his strength faltering with every breath. Yet his eyes, steady, unbroken, held the same quiet fire that had first drawn her toward him. "You shouldn't go alone," she said softly, voice cracking from the night's cold. He looked up, shaking his head. "If I stay, they will come. They won't stop until they find something to bury. The ache in her chest deepened. They'll think I helped you. They already do, he replied, fastening the strap across his shoulder. But if I leave now, maybe the wind will take my tracks. Maybe it will be enough. He started toward the trees, but she stepped closer. You'll die out there, she said, her hand trembling as she reached for him. You can't even stand straight, he stopped. The space between them filled with the sound of the creek and the rustle of leaves. For a moment she thought he would push her away, but instead he looked at her, not with pity, but something deeper. You shouldn't care this much, he said quietly. I don't, she lied, though her heart betrayed her with every word. He turned away, his figure blending into the mist. She stood there, watching him fade into the trees, her heart pounding as if warning her that something had already gone wrong. By the time she returned to the cabin, the world was fully awake. The sky burned with the red of a coming storm, and the air carried a charge that made her skin prickle. Her husband's boots were gone from by the door. The rifles were missing too. She knew what that meant. They were hunting again, closer this time. She walked to the porch and stared at the horizon. The men would ride north through the canyon, where his tracks would be easiest to find. He'd never make it across the ridge in time. She bit her lip until it bled. Every part of her screamed to stay inside, to let fate take its course. But something stronger than fear pulled at her. By noon, she had saddled one of the smaller horses from the barn and tied her bonnet tight against the wind. She didn't pack food, only a flask of water and her courage, both running low. The path to the canyon was narrow, winding through hills of scrub oak and dry grass, where vultures circled lazily above. Every turn felt like a heartbeat too loud, every shadow like an unseen watcher. She found him hours later near the ridge, half collapsed under the shade of a rock ledge. His skin was pale beneath the bronze and his breath came shallow. When he saw her, surprise flickered in his eyes, but not anger. You shouldn't have come, he rasped. They're close, she said, kneeling beside him. You won't make it alone. He tried to stand, wincing, his jaw tight. You don't understand. If they find you with me, I know, she said, cutting him off. But I can't go back. He looked at her for a long time as if trying to find a reason to argue. Finally, he sighed and leaned against the rock. The old trail runs east, he said. It'll take us through the dry ravine. They won't expect that way. They moved slowly, the sound of their steps drowned by the wind. The land stretched ahead, endless, merciless. She walked beside him, steadying his arm when he stumbled. Behind them, faint but growing, came the distant thunder of horses. As the sun sank behind the hills, the shadows grew long, and the canyon ahead turned gold with dying light. She could see smoke rising in the distance, campfires small but too many to be chance. They're already here, she whispered. He nodded grimly. We'll take the ravine. The descent was steep, the path slick with loose stones. She could barely see the way in the dim light. Every sound, the snap of a twig, the cry of a crow, sent her heart racing. When they reached the bottom, the air felt different, heavier, like a place forgotten by time. This is where your people lived? She asked quietly. He paused, scanning the narrow cliffs. Once, he said, before the soldiers came, before the promises. His voice broke slightly, though his face didn't. Now it's only ghosts. They pressed on, the walls closing in until only a strip of sky was visible above. The ground beneath their boots turned soft with clay. The sound of hooves echoed faintly through the canyon, bouncing off stone. She froze. They're following the ridge, he murmured. If they come down here, we're trapped. Then we have to keep moving, she said. But he didn't move. He was staring at something ahead, something she couldn't see at first. Then as her eyes adjusted, she saw it, the faint glow of a campfire through the mist. Figures moved around it, 3, maybe 4. Settlers, not tribesmen. Scouts from the search party. They must have split up, she whispered. He looked around, his gaze sharp. There's a cut in the rock up ahead. Stay low. They crept forward, keeping to the shadows. The ground was uneven, every pebble threatening to give them away. The men near the fire laughed softly, unaware. She could smell their coffee, hear the click of metal as one of them cleaned his rifle. She held her breath and kept moving. Then, somewhere behind them, a stone slipped and rolled. It was barely a sound, but enough. Voices rose. A shout cut through the canyon air. There, by the wall. He grabbed her hand, pulling her forward as the first shot rang out. The bullet struck the rock inches from her head, scattering dust across her face. They ran, through the dark, through the echoing canyon, the world exploding behind them with gunfire. Her lungs burned, her legs weak, but she didn't stop. They reached the narrow cut in the stone and slipped through just as another shot cracked. He stumbled, catching himself against the wall. She saw blood bloom again on his shoulder, deeper this time. "Keep going," he gasped. "Don't stop," she shook her head. "Not without you." They pressed onward until the path opened into a hollow, a dry basin surrounded by cliffs. It was quiet here, eerily so. The stars had begun to emerge, faint and distant, and the only sound was their ragged breathing. He sank to his knees near an old fire pit, his hand pressed against his wound. "This was our place," he murmured. "We would camp here before the hunts." She knelt beside him, trembling. "We'll rest just for a moment," she said, though she knew the men would soon find the trail. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a small carved figure, a bird, worn smooth by time. "My brother made this," he said quietly. "He said it would bring strength to whoever carried it." He pressed it into her palm. "If they find me, don't let them take you back." Tears welled in her eyes. "Stop talking like that." "You're not?" Before she could finish, the sound of horses echoed again, closer this time. Lantern light flickered at the mouth of the canyon. Shadows stretched across the rocks. She stood, heart pounding, the little bird clenched in her hand. He tried to rise, but faltered. She caught him, helping him to his feet. "We can still make it," she said, her voice shaking. He looked toward the horizon where the moon was rising, a pale, lonely witness. "If we run now, they'll chase us until the sun comes. If we stay, they'll burn this place again." The footsteps were getting louder. The glow of torches painted the cliffs in gold and orange. She could hear her husband's voice shouting orders, angry and desperate. The Apache's eyes met hers. "Whatever happens," he said, "don't let them see your fear." The words struck her like lightning, simple, strong, final. She gripped his arm, her heart hammering as the men reached the canyon floor. The echoes of their shouts filled the night, and as the first torchlight broke through the darkness, she felt the air tighten, heavy with everything left unsaid, love, loss, courage, and the kind of silence that comes before the storm truly begins. The air held its breath as the men closed in, their boots crunching against the stone, their torches casting restless shadows across the canyon walls. The sound of metal and shouting mixed with the low hum of the wind sweeping through the hollow. She stood beside the Apache, her hands shaking but steadying themselves on his arm. Every second felt stretched thin, drawn between the faint hope of escape and the certainty of what was to come. The firelight from the pursuers flickered closer, their faces coming into view. Hard, tense, determined. At their front rode her husband, his jaw clenched, eyes narrowed, the rifle resting across his saddle. When he saw her standing there beside the wounded warrior, something inside him snapped. His face twisted, not just in anger but in betrayal. "You!" he shouted, his voice echoing off the rock. "You helped him." She didn't deny it. She couldn't. "He didn't harm me," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "He saved me." "Saved you?" Her husband barked, spitting into the dirt. "He's one of them. He's the reason this land bleeds." The Apache stepped forward, though pain bent his body. "I did not take from you," he said calmly. "Your hate did that long before I came." Her husband raised his rifle, but his hand trembled. "You lie," he hissed. "You and your kind took my brother, my land, everything I had." The warrior's eyes darkened, but his tone stayed even. "Your brother died in the fire he started." A murmur ran through the men behind him. The truth sat heavy in the air. The husband's grip faltered for a moment, and in that pause, the world seemed to go still. The wind fell quiet, the torches flickered low, and the canyon listened. Then came the sound of a hammer being pulled back, metal against metal, followed by the echoing crack of a single gunshot. But it wasn't fired by the husband. One of the men beside him had panicked. The bullet struck the rock near her, splintering it into shards that cut across her cheek. The noise shattered the fragile stillness. Horses reared, men shouted, the firelight swayed wildly. In the confusion, the Apache pulled her behind the ridge, his hand gripping hers tightly. "Run," he whispered. They moved through the smoke and shouting, their steps muffled by the soft ground. She didn't know where they were going, only that they couldn't stop. Behind them, the gunfire echoed like thunder, and the scent of smoke filled the night. When they reached the far side of the canyon, he stopped, gasping for breath, his body trembling. He leaned against the rock, his blood dark against the pale moonlight. "You're hurt," she said, her voice breaking. "It's nothing," he whispered. Though his strength was fading fast, she tore a piece of her skirt and pressed it to his wound. but he caught her hand. "Don't waste time on me," he said. "Go east toward the ridge. There's a river. Follow it." "I'm not leaving you," she said fiercely. "You'll die here." He gave her a faint, tired smile. "Maybe, but you won't." The ground shook faintly with approaching hoofbeats. The torches were coming again, their light spreading through the canyon like a tide. He looked toward them, then back at her. "You once asked what I stayed here for," he said softly. "It wasn't the land. It was the promise that not all hearts were made for hate." Tears blurred her vision. "You kept that promise," she whispered. The sound of shouting grew closer. The Apache pushed himself away from the wall, his hand gripping the knife at his belt. "When they see me, they'll follow," he said. "They won't see you leave." "No," she said, shaking her head. "I won't let you." But he was already stepping out into the open, the moonlight catching the edge of his blade. He moved with the quiet grace of someone who had accepted the cost long ago. His silhouette against the canyon walls looked almost otherworldly, a figure caught between the earth and the sky. The men saw him and roared in fury. Shots rang out, echoing through the hollow. She fell to her knees behind the rock, covering her ears, praying it would stop. The last thing she heard was a sharp cry, then silence, so deep it seemed to swallow the world whole. When the noise faded, she crawled forward. Smoke clung to the air. The men were gone, or maybe they'd moved deeper into the canyon. She didn't know. All she could see was the moonlight falling over him where he lay still. She knelt beside him, her trembling hands brushing over his chest. His breath came faint, shallow, but it was there. He opened his eyes once more. "They'll leave soon," he whispered. "When they do, go home." She shook her head. "There's no home left for me." He looked at her, his gaze soft, almost peaceful. "Then make one," he said. "Where the wind doesn't carry their voices." She didn't know how long she stayed there. The stars faded, the night turned pale, and the first pink light of dawn stretched across the horizon. When the riders finally left the valley, she covered him with his blanket, pressing the carved bird into his hand. It felt wrong to say goodbye, because it wasn't just him she was losing, but the only piece of truth she'd ever found in this hard world. She walked east, just as he'd told her. Days passed. The land changed from red earth to green hills, the scent of rain fading to sage and cedar. Every mile carried her farther from Dry Hollow, from the lies that had built that life. But the silence followed her. His silence, not empty but full, like something sacred she carried with her. Weeks later, she found herself near a small frontier town on the edge of a river valley. The people there were kinder, quieter. They didn't ask where she came from, and she didn't offer it. She worked in a small stable, mending harnesses, earning just enough to keep a roof over her head. But every evening, when the sun sank behind the ridge, she'd walk to the river and watch the sky turn gold and red, the same colors that once lit the canyon. One night, a child from the town brought her a small package left by a passing trader. Inside was a carved bird, almost identical to the one she'd left behind. Her breath caught. She turned it over in her hands, tracing the familiar lines. Tied around its neck was a strip of leather with a single phrase carved into it. "Still breathing." She smiled through her tears. Maybe he had lived, or maybe it was his way of reminding her that she had. Either way, she knew the meaning. The land that once tore lives apart had somehow bound two souls together in its dust and thunder. Seasons changed. The river grew, the town expanded, and new settlers came through with stories of the old territories, of raids, of burned ranches, of a place once called Dry Hollow that no one lived in anymore. They said the land had gone quiet there, that nothing grew except wildflowers that covered the hills after every storm. Sometimes, when the wind shifted, she could almost hear it again, the echo of drums rolling faint through the distance, the whisper of the prairie telling its stories. It didn't frighten her anymore. She had learned what the Apache had meant, that the land listens, and it remembers. Years later, when her hair had turned silver, she was still known as the quiet woman by the river. Children brought her flowers, travelers stopped to rest, and some swore they'd seen a tall, dark man watching from the ridge on evenings when the light was red. She never said a word about it. She'd simply smile, her eyes turning toward the horizon, where the sun met the earth. And in that silence, she knew peace. The kind born not from forgetting, but from remembering with gentleness. The kind that grows in hearts once torn by fear but mended by understanding. The story of the mail-order bride and the lonely Apache warrior faded from the tongues of men, but not from the land. The hills of the old territory kept it safe, carried in the wind that still hummed through the canyons and the soft rustle of grass after rain. And though time swept away the villages, the fences, the names, something of them remained. Two souls who had met in a broken world and taught it, for a moment, to listen. And so, beneath the endless western sky, the story ended not in fire or vengeance, but in silence and memory, the kind that keeps the world alive long after voices are gone.